When Vicki and I started in full-time ministry, my first church was 10 miles from everywhere. The church had pulled a trailer in, and it's where we lived, and with that trailer in place, they poured one sidewalk with steps into the trailer. It was the only entrance that allowed us to get into the trailer very easily. But because there were snakes everywhere, one of the deacons loaned me a shotgun. He said, "You might need this if you come across a snake." I felt real comfortable at that part. So I kept it tucked in the closet out of sight, but readily available if a fork-tongued devil slithered too close. One day we came home and pulled the car to a stop and shut down the engine. I got out of the car and started to go into the house when, at the base of the steps, on the concrete where I had to cross, was a rattlesnake sunning itself. The gun was in the house, so I dared not step over him. But there was a back door, but it was about 4 feet off the ground. I had no choice. I walked around the trailer, crawled up into the trailer, and came back with a shotgun. Now I had the problem of having to get down. So I carefully edged my way, holding the barrel of the shotgun away, lest the calamity of the day was me. I went back around to the sidewalk and I stood over the snake and I took aim. Then I broke out in a bad case of sanity. I started to think, if I stood there and fired, I would get a face full of buckshot back from the ricochet. I took a step back, fired at an angle, and the snake just disappeared in the blast. And I left a divot worthy of any bad golfer. That's the problem with influence. It's the buckshot that comes back at us that's our problem. As we discuss influence in this series, we need to be aware of the flip side of our desire to influence others. Now, while we want to influence the world for Christ, others are attempting to influence us at the same time. As much as we'd like to think we're shaping other people, we are being shaped. And that is the flip side of influence. How do we deal with the influences on us so that we may prevent others from feeling our influence? Let's look at the reality of this influence from someone we know quite well. In the early chapters of Genesis, we see humanity unfolding. We come to the flood and we watch Noah's patience and faith preserve mankind through the ark. But time passes, and then we come to the father of the faithful, Abraham. It is in the midst of Abraham's story we find the connective tissue of influence. Abraham had a nephew named Lot. Now just think about Lot. He had good bloodlines. He was related to Abraham himself. And he made the journey with his uncle to this place unknown because he took the leap as well as did Abraham. But the time came when competing flocks created tension. Prosperity forced choices. The time came when competing flocks created friction. Prosperity forced choices. Abraham deferred the choice of land to Lot, and Lot looked at the good places, but he lacked the insight into the underbelly of his choice. It tells us in Genesis chapter 13, "And Lot lifted up his eyes, and he saw the Jordan Valley was well watered, like the garden of the Lord, like Egypt in the direction of Zoar." Now this was before the time the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east. Thus they separated from each other, and Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valleys and moved his tent as far as Sodom. Now, the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. It seemed innocent enough. It was a business decision. Surely he could live in the land unscathed by the Sodomites. But more happened, because influence never rests. Instead, it keeps pushing. A raiding party from a rival chieftain came and they captured hostages. And Genesis 14 gives us this little insight into what's happening. They also took Lot, the son of Abram's brother, who was now dwelling in Sodom, and his possessions, and they went away. He was now living in Sodom. He stopped living in tents. He moved into town. He became a prominent citizen, one of those town leaders. He and his wife had 2 daughters who grew up into adulthood in Lot's household. All seemed to be good. But something was happening to Lot. He was changing ever so subtly. And it really remained hidden from his view until the crisis unfolded. It started with a visit from the angels who delivered the news of Sodom's destruction to Abram himself. Listen to what Genesis 19, how it begins. The 2 angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. And when Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed himself with his face to the earth. Lot could at least still recognize them as God's messengers, and they told him of the coming conflagration. Then came the course pounding on his door. The men of Sodom wanted to have their way with the angels. It was lewd and it was violent. Lot intervened. Surely, he felt, he could reason with them. But it was not reason that Lot took to that door. It was the last shred of his morality. Instead, he offered his daughters to the lust-filled mob. How can a father sink so far? Leave now. That was the angel's message. And so Lot went to his sons-in-law to persuade them. So Lot went out, said to his sons-in-law who were to marry his daughters, get out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy the city. But he seemed to his sons-in-law to be jesting. Without realizing it, whatever sway he thought he had over his children had slipped from his grasp. It was time to go. But the town had gotten into him and he yearned to stay. But the angels refused. He lingered. So the men seized him and his wife and his 2 daughters by the hand, the Lord being merciful to them, and brought them out and set them outside the city. They fled. His wife, whose heart was in Sodom, glanced backwards, became a pillar of salt. Out of Zoar, they could see the fires lighting up the night sky. His home was gone. His wife was gone. But it would claim even more. His daughters would conspire against him. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve offspring from our father. They planned incest, and thus both daughters of Lot became pregnant by their father. In the end, any shred of morality he tried to keep for himself and teach his family vanished. Sodom had won. Influence moves on sock feet. You never hear it. Many times you never see it until the fruit sprouts in your life. See, Paul was correct when he said, do not be deceived. Bad company ruins good morals. We know that. It's proverbial. Bad apples ruin good ones. Moldy bread spreads the mold of the good slices. Whether we want to admit it or not, our surroundings affect us, and what goes into our minds comes out in our lives. Lot chose his environment. He chose his friends. He chose his city. He chose everything but the unintended consequences. He never thought it could happen to him. And we don't think it can happen to us as well. So it sounds like the answer then is to just get away from it all. Find a mountaintop in Idaho, build a cabin on it, disconnect from the internet, junk the satellite dish on the roof, and threaten anybody who comes close. And you can do that, but it does 2 things. The first is it keeps you and I from influencing anybody else, because salt and salt shakers don't make food better. Lamps under bushels cast no light. Second, it doesn't guarantee anything either. In Matthew chapter 4, Jesus was alone in the desert, but he's not alone. The devil is there, And then he is there with all of his humanity. He feels hunger like we do. He had this human need to prove himself that he is somebody important like we do. And then, as we do, everybody wants to avoid pain. And they want the shortcut out if we can. But all of those are cracked open doors for the devil's influence. But Jesus repels the darts coming at him. But it's not over when it seems to be over. Not on your life. Listen to what Luke tells us as kind of an appendix to the story. And when the devil had ended his temptation, he departed from him until an important, opportune time. It's only a temporary reprieve. Influence is the steady drip of spiritual torture on the lives of godly people. But there's a reason for the influence we feel in our lives. There is this need in humanity that creates the influence we sometimes feel from others. Now, Peter reflects on why persecution is coming to these Christians, these moral people, these good citizens, these nice neighbors, these people who are living far better than everyone else is. And it looks like they would want to draw them, but that's not what happens. So Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 4, we no longer live the rest of time in the flesh for our human passions, but for the will of God. For the time that is past suffices for doing what the Gentiles want to do, living in sensuality and passions and drunkenness and orgies and drinking parties and lawless idolatry. What Peter says is Christians are distinct. Their lives are like diamond against black velvet. But that means they also have a problem. Worldly people see that and they want to bring Christians down to their level to create a sense of equality. He goes on in verse 4. With respect to this, they are surprised that you don't join them in the same flood of debauchery, and they malign you. The reason for the abuse is the dissonance that they feel. When someone exhibits higher standards, one of purity and integrity, others see that and there's something that happens in them. They want to bring everything down to their level. And that way, they are the same as us. And us, by extension, we are as good or as bad as they are. When I was a boy, my mother enrolled me in an archery class in summer to keep me busy. Now, I loved it. I got pretty good at it. But as I reflect on it, as soon as you saw the target, the bullseye at the center drew your attention to it. You never saw the green grass on the other side of the target. You didn't even see the green grass in front of the target. Instead, you focused on the ideal, the perfect, dead center, and that's what you aimed for. Someone has said, the arrow does not seek the target draws the arrow. Christian influence gets attacked because it threatens people, even those who would protest that's not true. Because if the world can bring us to their level, it destroys our influence with them. So what's the remedy to this situation? Well, the remedy comes in two forms. The first is recognition. One of our basic flaws is we ignore the simple issue that forces are working on us and shaping us in some way. Paul warned the Corinthians about the internal influences in the church there. That they were tolerating a man who took his stepmother for his wife. The gross immorality not tolerated even among the worst of the worst in Corinth. And he goes on to tell them, your boasting is no good. Don't you know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? It's so proverbial, he quotes the same things to the Galatians. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. It's the small, unseen particle of spiritual ferment that begins to work. And it's very silent. And unless you recognize that leavening is taking place in life, it soon just overwhelms you. That's what happened to Peter. Jesus warned Peter of the pressures on him. When Jesus started talking about his death, the death on the cross at the hand of the Jewish leaders, Peter wanted to hear nothing of this defeatist attitude, so he turns and rebukes Jesus. And Jesus fired back, a warning volley. Mark chapter 8, verse 33. But turning to his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you're setting your mind on the things of God, not the things of men." He said, "Peter, Satan's too close to you." Warning given, warning ignored, and it wasn't over. It came to that night, the night of Passover, the night that Jesus would be betrayed. And there in that room, following the institution of what we call the Lord's Supper, Jesus speaks to his disciples. "You will all fall away. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. But after I'm raised up, I will go before you to Galilee." And Peter says, "Even though they all fall away, I won't." Jesus told them the truth. In a few short hours, a moment in the garden would come. Fear would overwhelm them. They would run for their lives. Now, again, Peter would have none of it. There was no way under heaven he was ever going to become a turncoat. But Jesus wasn't finished with his warning. It suddenly becomes intensely personal for Peter. And Jesus says to him, "I'm telling you, this very night, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. But he said emphatically, "If I must die with you, I will never ever deny you." Everybody else said the same thing. Jesus says, "You don't know how much pressure you're under, Peter. Because in a few short hours, the pressure will collapse your allegiance like a house of cards." Peter didn't seem to think much about this. He believed it could never happen to him. And yet, in a courtyard, around a charcoal fire, he spit out the words of denial without even thinking about them. The pressure pushed him to traitor. See, our problem is twofold. One is we don't believe the pressure is that real. But the second is worse. We don't realize our weakened condition. We are not as strong as we think we are. I like the story told about the teenager started hanging out with the wrong kinds of friends, and his father grew concerned. And so he took him aside and admonished him. He said, "You need to stay away from those guys because they're not any good." "But Dad," he replied, "I'm just trying to be like Jesus. He was a friend of sinners." And the father, without missing a beat, said, "Well, that's fine, but you're not Jesus." We're constantly being bombarded by words, images, and relationships and ideas, and none of us are immune. No one is. So be careful is important. The words. We must heed Paul's counsel. "Therefore, if anyone thinks that he stands, take heed, lest he fall." Knowing is half the equation, but the remainder is resistance. We tend, like Peter, to believe in our own willpower. But don't you grow tired? Usually, temptation doesn't send an engraved announcements proclaiming date of time and arrival. Instead, we're always being shaped at the worst possible time. What you have at the moment is what you're going to have to use. And so part of resistance is replacing the perverted with the innocent. Paul would continue with the leaven problem. He would go on to say, "Cleanse out the old leaven that you may be a new lump." as you are really unleavened. Paul's talking to him and said, you need to deal with this person who's creating the problems in your church, who's brought this immorality in, because he's the leaven in the lump, and you need to get rid of the leaven, the things that are bothering you, the things that are destroying your faith. You clean out the leaven. Now, we get our tradition of spring cleaning from the Jews at Passover. They were instructed to sweep their houses of all the yeast. And we need to periodically sweep our lives of the things that create the problems for us and that are influencing us in the wrong direction. Take an inventory sometime. What Facebook friends pull you down or mislead you? Do you really need to have friends like that? What about websites you visit? Do they bring you closer to Christ or sow discord in your heart? What about the media you consume? When you fire up Netflix, what does the latest have-to-see binge-worthy series do to your spiritual senses? Remember, we get the most of our influence, like Lot, by moving too close to Sodom. The problem is we don't end up living in Sodom. Sodom ends up living in us. And the principle is simple. It's a principle of a force field. There are two forces on each side, and the force that is greatest and strongest will prevail. Think about two guys sitting at a table when one of them challenges the other ones to an arm wrestle. They lock palms and they just go to town at it. And they grunt and they groan and they're sweating and they're pushing it hard and shoving. And they can't seem to make any movement. But the one who has the best resources, who has the most resources, will prevail and will win. When influence pushes, we have to push back harder. And that means we need to have a rather large spiritual friend. Have you eaten your spiritual Wheaties? What goes into your life to fortify influence for good and repel the influence for evil? Now, one is the fellowship of the saints. Now, we become like the people we are around. That is axiomatic. And so you put the good leaven in your life so it can grow. And we change for good when we surround ourselves with people who influence us for good. And if we're going to be influenced, we might as well make it a positive influence. So the people you're around will influence. Secondly, the anchor holding your life has to be steady, because if it's not, in the storms, nothing is going to hold. The psalmist said in Psalm 119:97, "Oh, how I love your law. It is my meditation all the day." The law was his meditation. He's not talking about sitting cross-legged on a cushion. Instead, the word means to constantly go over in your mind. It's something that's repetitive, ever-flowing. In fact, in a negative way, it's used of constant complaining. It's that kind of repetitive behavior, that kind of over and over storing away of your life. And that's not necessarily more information. We believe that somehow if we just knew more, we would be better. We usually know so much more than we'll ever do. But it's really about drilling deep down in the heart and letting God's truth shape and frame the values we use for our living. Resistance is avoiding what makes us weak and doing more of what makes us strong. And while that's easy to say, it really is hard to do. And as much as we wish otherwise, influence flows both ways. The world tugs at us as we try to rub off on it. The only issue is who's stronger in your life. See, people watch Christians struggle with the same problems they do. We are not immune from the struggles of life. And they want to see if Christianity really does work under pressure. So they're watching. Now, they may take pot shots, but they want to know, can you stand it? And if we learn nothing else in the last 12 months, it should be this one simple fact. Things spread. The bad spreads with the good. And if the good is not overcome by evil, it can infiltrate the world. It can spread as well. That's influence. But how do we maintain our influence under the forces exerted on us? Well, first of all, know yourself. Who are you? What are your weaknesses? What's coming at your life right now? The person most at risk is the one who believes he's immune. So get real with what's happening in your own heart. That's the only way you know how that you can repel any kind of influence coming at you, is to know who you are. But the second is to know your holes. You realize you don't have to bolt the door to keep the flies and mosquitoes out of your house. Instead, you can have a screen door, and it lets the air in without the pests. But if it has a hole in it, that's where the flies come in. So what are the holes you have in your life? What's unguarded in your life, allowing any information in? Perhaps you need to fix the holes and plug them up, and that will keep the world at bay from entering your mind and your heart. But the third is to know your reason. Many times people lose their influence and get influenced in the wrong direction because they forgot the why God gave them life. The reason for your spiritual life is important. Why did you become a Christian in the first place? What has it done for you over the years? When you're facing the onslaught of influence, those answers can do a lot for you. And we need to remember that our influence can be powerful. In 1962, an outbreak happened at a girls' school in Tanzania. One girl started laughing. Soon, laughter spread from girl to girl until 95 of the 157 students could not stop laughing. And it got so bad the school had to close because it couldn't control all the laughter. And the phenomenon lasted 18 months, it closed 14 schools and affected over 1,000 students. See, joy and good can spread as well as evil. And we pray that that kind of Christian joy can overcome this world and its pressure on us. Thank you for joining me. I'll be back with another lesson next Sunday.